It's known locally as Bishop Hill. There are a large number of stories to be told about Bishop Hill, and I'm going to have time to tell you about just one location tonight. Right in the middle of the district is a road called Bishop Hill Junior, and there in Bishop Hill Junior, a church called S.A.W. Well worth a visit. The tower of the church is the oldest complete structure remaining in York. It was there before the time of William the Conqueror, 1066, so it is believed, therefore, to be the only remaining complete Viking building still in York. You'll see that if you go up there and look at the architecture and the way that it's built. But you may also become aware while you're there of a strange atmosphere that seems to hang in the air in that part of the city. You may therefore be a little disappointed when I tell you that it is not the church nor its tower that is the subject of the hauntings, but the building right next door. That building is very much younger, only about 100 years old at the most, and it was until very recently a dancing school run by Mr. and Mrs. Cole. You were able to see that if you stood outside and read the sign that once was above the door. But if you allowed your eye to follow the pinnacle of the porch to its point, there you saw the Holy Cross that told you that at one time that building was a part of the church. But not now. As I say, disused dancing school. But so many strange and unexplained events occurred there that I will only be able to tell you a few of them tonight. The most frequent occurrence took place when there weren't many people in the building. Perhaps the dancing had stopped for a while. All of a sudden the atmosphere in the room turned cold, and in the silence that followed, footsteps were heard, crossing from the side of the building nearest to the church to the centre of the dance floor. The footsteps stopped, nothing could be seen, but then there was the sound of money being poured from a box onto a great wooden table. A table that wasn't there. The money was then counted by being slid across the table, coin by coin, back into the box. And as this process continued, the volume of the sound increased, until at last it was ended by a near-shattering crash as the lid of the box was slammed shut. As that crash reverberated around the room, the footsteps returned the way they had come, back towards the church. And as they faded away, witnesses said that the atmosphere in the room turned slowly back to normal. Although they, the witnesses, never did. Another time, Mr. and Mrs. Cole were away. They were taking their annual holiday, and a friend of theirs was looking after the dancing school. Dancing had finished, everyone had gone home. And he was just wandering around, switching off the lights and locking the doors before going home himself, when he heard a violent knocking on the rear door to the building. He shouted out, "Come round the front, the door's always open." Always was. Any time they were dancing in the hall, the front door was always wide open. And he was ignored. The violence of the knocking increased, and suddenly the door handle was being turned and the door shaken with such force that he grew alarmed for the safety of whomever was outside. It was obvious that they desperately needed to get in. He ran to the door and he shouted through it, "Quick, run round the front, door's open. This one's locked, I can't find the key." Again he was ignored and the violence of the knocking increased. He realised that perhaps his voice couldn't be heard above the sound of the banging. So he found a table, pushed it against the door and climbed on it. He was intending to look through the little window at the top so that he could indicate to whomever was outside that they must run round the front. But when he looked through the window, he got the shock of his life, because there was nobody outside, but the door was still being knocked and shaken. He left the building in such a hurry that night that later the police had to go to the home of Mrs. Marshall, Mrs. Cole's mother, to ask her if she would very kindly return to the building with them, switch off the lights and lock the doors. And Mrs. Marshall herself had an experience there that she said she would never be able to forget. One day she was working downstairs in the cellar. It used to be the storeroom, where they kept their props and bits and pieces. And while she was working, she said the atmosphere in the room turned suddenly cold, then became hostile. So hostile that she knew, without anybody saying a word, that her presence wasn't wanted. She turned immediately and started to leave the room, but had hardly gone a couple of paces before she was pushed violently across the cellar floor and sent sprawling up the steps. Her first thought was that perhaps it was a member of the dancing school who had hidden down there and was playing what they thought was a joke on her. So she turned round to tell them what she thought of their joke, only to find when she turned round that the room was still empty. But the feeling of hostility was now so powerful that the only thing she could do was scramble up the steps and vow never to go back there again. By this time, Mr. and Mrs. Cole were getting so concerned by all these strange and unexplained events in the building, they decided that they would take up the offer of help to a friend of theirs. This friend was a medium. She said she had the ability to contact the spirits of the dead. She said she would try to find out who it was haunting the dancing school, why they were haunting it, and if possible, she would put the building and the spirit at peace. Afterwards, she had to admit that she was no wiser than she had been before. She didn't know who the spirit was or why it was haunting, but she was able to reassure them that both the building and the spirit were now at peace. And that's the way that the story is told in John Mitchell's book, which, as I said at the beginning of the walk, was first published in 1975. But not very long ago, one of our guides met Mr. and Mrs. Cole at a wedding. And as you can imagine, they soon started talking about the haunted dancing school. And Mr. Cole said, well, yes, that's true. That's how it was in 1975, full stop. But it's not true now, he went on. Started again. But now, it's much worse. So if you want an experience, just go up to Bishop Hill Junior. Stand outside St. Mary's Church. I'm certain that you will be able to feel the atmosphere. You don't seem too keen.